The air was heavy that June evening, the kind of warm humidity that clings to the skin and makes even small towns feel restless. Graduation night had arrived, and in the modest community of Ridgefield, it was more than a ceremony. It was a rite of passage. Families filled the high school auditorium, applauding as their children crossed the stage, tassels swinging, futures wide open. For most, it was a night of pride, relief, and laughter. For one family, it would become the beginning of a nightmare that would last 15 years. Emily Hart had been at the center of it all. 18 years old, dressed in a white gown with a scarlet sash, she represented everything the town cherished. Teachers described her as a natural leader, friends leaned on her, and her family spoke of her with the certainty that she would do great things. She had plans to attend a state university in the fall, majoring in education. In photographs taken that evening, her smile was wide, her arms draped around her friends, her eyes bright under the fluorescent lights. Nothing in those images suggested she would soon vanish without a trace. After the graduation ceremony, the students poured into the gymnasium for the traditional dance. Parents cleared out, leaving music, sweat, and celebration behind. It was a final gathering of a class that had grown up together, now standing on the threshold of adulthood. Witnesses later remembered Emily as radiant that night, moving from group to group, laughing, talking, occasionally glancing at her phone. She didn't drink, she didn't stir conflict. She was simply part of the current of energy moving through the crowded gym. Hours passed, and as midnight neared, the crowd began to thin. Some students slipped away to house parties, others headed home. But Emily lingered. Her closest friends recalled that she danced to the final song before joining them near the bleachers to gather belongings. She spoke briefly with her ex-boyfriend, who was there with his own group, and then she disappeared into the crowd. What happened in the following minutes has never been fully understood. By the time the last stragglers left the gym, Emily was gone. At first, no one thought anything unusual of it. Graduation night often scattered students across the town. But the following morning, her absence was undeniable. She had not returned home, had not called her parents, had not answered her phone. When her family tried to reach her friends, each gave a different account of when they had last seen her. Some swore they spotted her leaving through the main doors. Others thought she had gone toward the parking lot. A few insisted she had been speaking with someone near the side exit. The conflicting stories blurred what should have been a clear timeline. Concern turned to panic when Emily's car was discovered still parked near the gym. Inside were her purse and phone, untouched. It was as if she had stepped out for only a moment and never returned. The police were notified, and by midday, the word had spread through Ridgefield. One of their own had vanished on a night meant for celebration. Detectives began with logical explanations. Had Emily simply chosen to run away? Was she hiding out with someone, or had she been overwhelmed by the pressure of her future? Those theories crumbled quickly. Emily's close bond with her family, her detailed college preparations, and the fact that she had left all her essentials behind didn't fit the profile of a runaway. Her parents insisted she had been excited for the next chapter of her life. Friends supported that claim, saying she had spoken all night about the fall semester, about moving into the dorms, about the independence she was eager to embrace. The town's police force expanded their search into the surrounding woods, creeks, and abandoned farm buildings. Volunteers joined, combing through the fields in long human chains. Helicopters circled overhead, and dogs were brought in to track her scent. Yet, no trail emerged. It was as though Emily had evaporated in the time it took her classmates to blink. Reporters descended on Ridgefield within days. For the first time in its history, the small community found itself in the glare of national coverage. Photographs of Emily were printed on posters, stapled to telephone poles, taped to shop windows. Her parents appeared in front of cameras, begging for information, describing their daughter as a gentle soul who had never hurt anyone. They spoke of her dreams, her kindness, her bright future, but also of the unbearable silence that had now taken her place at the dinner table. Police worked around the clock, interviewing anyone who had crossed paths with Emily that night. Every friend, every classmate, every staff member on duty at the school was questioned. but the answers they gave only deepened the confusion. How could dozens of people, all present in one building, remember her in so many different places at once? Investigators began to suspect that someone was lying, intentionally or not, and that the truth of Emily's final steps remained hidden. As the first week passed, the tension in Ridgefield grew unbearable. Parents kept their children close, locking doors that had always been left open, pulling them inside once the sun dipped below the horizon. Rumors took root in the silence, spreading from house to house, painting suspects out of shadows. Whispers grew about Emily's ex-boyfriend, about jealous friends, about a janitor with keys to every door. Yet with no body, no weapon, and no physical evidence, every suspicion collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. For Emily's family, the unrelenting heat of that summer marked the beginning of a long season of grief and unanswered questions. They replayed her final night over and over, clinging to the details they had: the white gown, the scarlet sash, her laughter echoing in the gymnasium. But the moment she walked toward the parking lot, her trail ended. And somewhere in that silence, one terrible truth remained. Emily Hart had vanished on the night of her graduation, and no one could explain how. The hours after Emily Hart's disappearance stretched into the longest night her family had ever known. By morning, her parents, exhausted and frightened, returned to the school parking lot where her car still sat untouched. The passenger seat still carried the small blanket she often used on late-night drives, and in the back was the box of graduation flowers she had been given earlier that evening. Everything about the car suggested she had fully intended to return to it. The discovery intensified the urgency of the search. Police quickly mobilized, establishing a command post near the gymnasium. At first, the focus was tight: the school building itself, the parking lot, and the immediate streets that bordered it. Officers moved methodically, checking doors, storage rooms, and even the rooftop. As word spread, the search began to expand outward. By afternoon, volunteers from the town joined in, fanning across the nearby woods and creeks that skirted Ridgefield. Parents walked side by side with neighbors, teachers held flashlights, and strangers called out Emily's name into the thick summer air. The terrain was familiar to many. Kids had played in those woods for years, fishing in the streams and building forts from fallen branches. But now the same places took on an ominous tone. Each snapped twig, each discarded piece of clothing was scrutinized with fear. Search dogs were brought in, trained to track scent through undergrowth and mud, but after a few hours their handlers admitted the trail broke down quickly. The dogs circled near the school before losing direction entirely, as though Emily had vanished just beyond the walls of the gym. Despite the massive turnout, no solid evidence appeared. Volunteers trudged through the fields until their legs ached, returning with only exhaustion and frustration. Some claimed to see flashes of white fabric caught in the brush, but when investigated, it turned out to be trash or weathered cloth. By the end of the first day, the community's determination collided with the sickening reality that Emily had not left an obvious trail. That void created space for rumors. Some classmates began speculating in whispers that Emily had willingly left with someone, maybe a boyfriend she hadn't told her family about. Others leaned toward darker theories, that she'd been abducted by a stranger waiting outside the gym. The problem was, every theory seemed to crumble as quickly as it formed. Emily's closest friends swore she had never mentioned running away, never hinted at a secret relationship, and was too grounded in her family to disappear on purpose. Yet without physical evidence, even the most loyal friends couldn't stop the spread of speculation. Detectives tried to tighten the focus by returning to the accounts of students who had been inside the gym during the final moments. One girl said she was sure she saw Emily near the bleachers around midnight, gathering her things. Another boy recalled her heading toward the side exit, almost as though she were meeting someone. A group of friends believed they saw her stepping into the parking lot. The statements overlapped but never aligned, creating a fog that investigators couldn't cut through. It was possible that in the chaos of the night, memories blurred. But it was also possible that one of the accounts was intentionally misleading. The contradictions troubled investigators. They began to suspect that someone in that gym wasn't being truthful. Graduation night had been filled with emotions: jealousy, alcohol at after-parties, long simmering rivalries, and they considered whether Emily might have been drawn into an argument or situation that escalated. Detectives pressed her friends harder, circling back with the same questions at different times to catch inconsistencies. Some students bristled under the repeated interviews, while others grew defensive, claiming they had nothing to hide. The media only amplified the pressure. News vans lined the streets by the second day, capturing footage of weary search parties and distraught family members. Reporters asked blunt questions about suspects, about Emily's personal life, about the possibility of foul play. The town, normally shielded from national attention, suddenly felt exposed. For Emily's parents, each camera only deepened their pain, turning their daughter's disappearance into a public spectacle. As the first week dragged on, frustration boiled over. Searchers began questioning why no evidence had surfaced, even after helicopters scanned the riverbeds and divers explored the deeper ponds. Every new day without discovery felt heavier, as though the window of survival was closing rapidly. Detectives stressed that the first 48 hours in a missing persons case were critical. By day 7, hope was already beginning to thin, though no one wanted to admit it aloud. One detail nagged investigators more than the rest. Every confirmed sighting of Emily placed her inside the gym before midnight. Not a single witness could clearly account for her movements once the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed. It was as though her trail simply stopped at the threshold between the bleachers and the exit doors. Police began to wonder if, instead of vanishing outside, the truth of what happened to Emily might have started inside those walls. But without physical evidence, suspicion was all they had. And for a grieving family and a town desperate for clarity, suspicion wasn't enough. Theories multiplied, friendships fractured, and whispers of guilt circulated in quiet conversations. The search for Emily Hart was far from over, but the first week had already revealed a chilling possibility. Her disappearance wasn't the work of chance, but the result of someone's silence. In the days following Emily Hart's disappearance, the investigation turned from frantic search efforts to the painstaking process of narrowing suspects. Detectives knew that when a young woman vanished, the explanation was rarely random. More often, it was someone close, someone with motive, opportunity, or a hidden grudge. With conflicting witness statements clouding the night's timeline, police began constructing a list of those who might have had reason to hurt Emily. That list quickly drew attention not only inside the community, but across the country as the case captured national headlines. At the top was her ex-boyfriend, Ryan Cole. Just weeks before graduation, Emily had ended their 2-year relationship, citing differences in their futures. Ryan had been moody in the aftermath, friends recalled, and was seen drinking heavily at gatherings in the days that followed. On graduation night, he and Emily were spotted speaking briefly near the gym bleachers, though no one could recall the tone of the exchange. For detectives, it was the first clear lead. A spurned partner, seen with the missing girl minutes before she vanished, was a narrative too strong to ignore. Ryan was questioned within 48 hours. The media ran with the story, plastering his image beside Emily's in nightly broadcasts. Rumors swirled that he had stalked her, that he had begged her to take him back, that he had threatened to harm her if she refused. Ryan denied all of it. He admitted to being heartbroken, admitted to drinking that night, but insisted he had left the gym before Emily disappeared. Detectives subjected him to a polygraph, which he passed. His alibi, that he'd gone to a classmate's after-party and remained there until morning, was confirmed by multiple attendees. Despite suspicion from the public, the evidence against him dissolved. Attention then shifted to someone less visible, but perhaps more dangerous: the school janitor, Charles Denton. At 47, Denton had worked maintenance jobs across several towns, always moving after only a few years. When police looked into his record, they found troubling entries, allegations of inappropriate behavior at past schools, never resulting in charges, but enough to raise alarms. On graduation night, he had been assigned to oversee the gym, locking up after the dance. The possibility that Emily had crossed paths with him in those final minutes unsettled detectives. For several days, Denton was treated as the prime suspect. His home was searched, his vehicle examined, his background dissected in the press. Reporters uncovered stories from former co-workers describing him as odd, temperamental, and too interested in students' personal lives. Parents in Ridgefield recoiled, demanding answers. But when investigators dug into his movements, his alibi held. Surveillance footage placed him at a hardware store minutes after locking up the gym, a time that overlapped with the window when Emily was last seen. Store employees confirmed his presence, and his time card matched. Forensic teams found no trace of Emily in his home or car. With no physical evidence, suspicion against him collapsed as quickly as it had risen. The final name on the list rattled the community most of all: Emily's best friend, Sarah Jennings. The two girls had grown up together, inseparable since grade school. But witnesses recalled seeing them argue that night. Some described raised voices near the restroom, others a cold silence afterward. Investigators pressed Sarah hard, aware that fights between close friends could sometimes end tragically. The media seized the narrative, speculating on jealousy over a boy, a college opportunity, or an unspoken betrayal. Sarah found herself cornered in her own town, painted by strangers as the girl who might have turned on her best friend. Her parents hired a lawyer, but Sarah cooperated fully. She admitted the argument, explaining it had been about something trivial, a misunderstanding over who Emily was supposed to ride home with. She insisted they had made up by the end of the night. Timeline checks seemed to support her claim. Phone records placed Sarah texting her parents from her house around the time Emily was last seen. Neighbors confirmed she had been home before 1 in the morning. With her alibi intact, detectives concluded that the fight had been heated, but not fatal. For the Hart family, the rise and fall of each suspect was devastating. Every time the police leaned toward someone, they braced themselves for answers, only to watch the case collapse. Each name carried the hope of resolution and the fear of betrayal. When Ryan was ruled out, it hurt to know her last conversation might never be explained. When Denton was cleared, the relief of innocence gave way to despair that danger still lurked unidentified. When Sarah was released from scrutiny, the family was left with no closer path to the truth. For the community, the suspect list left scars. Trust fractured between neighbors. Parents whispered in the stands at baseball games, wondering which family carried secrets. Students who had celebrated graduation together now eyed each other with suspicion, replaying the night in their heads, questioning if they had overlooked something. Rumors became the language of Ridgefield, each one eroding what had once been a town defined by closeness. The investigation stalled under the weight of these failures. Detectives had exhausted the obvious leads. Without physical evidence, without a body, every suspect walked free. It left the Hart family staring into a void that only deepened with time. Theories continued to swirl, but none held water. And in the silence of that uncertainty, one fact became harder to escape. If the truth had been within the suspect list, it was buried too deep to find. But detectives could not shake one thought. Each of the suspects had cracks in their story, inconsistencies or coincidences that never sat comfortably. Someone had crossed paths with Emily in those final moments. Someone knew more than they admitted. The case wasn't closed, but it was suspended in limbo, leaving a town unsettled, a family broken, and a mystery that only grew colder with each passing day. As weeks turned into months, the absence of answers began to suffocate Ridgefield. At first, there had been noise, news crews outside the school, helicopters circling the woods, vigils lit by candlelight. But with every fruitless search, every dead-end interview, the noise dulled. By the 1-year mark, silence had become the defining sound of Emily Hart's case. That silence carried weight. It hung over the school where she had last been seen, stretching long shadows down empty hallways. For the students who returned in the fall, the gymnasium felt transformed. What had once been the site of basketball games and dances now carried an unspoken heaviness. Some refused to enter alone. Others whispered stories that Emily's spirit lingered there, a restless echo of a night no one could explain. Teachers tried to downplay it, but even they admitted to a chill when locking up after dark. In Ridgefield, rumor filled the void left by fact. Each family had its own version of what might have happened, and the speculation hardened into myths. Some said Emily had been taken by someone passing through town, a predator who knew how to vanish without trace. Others insisted the answer had to be closer, that someone inside that gym was still hiding the truth. A few even leaned toward superstition, claiming the building itself held a curse, that her disappearance marked the town in a way they would never shake. For Emily's parents, silence was not an option. They marked her birthday by lining the front porch with candles, each flame flickering against the dark as neighbors joined in uneasy solidarity. They spoke to reporters even after the cameras had long stopped rolling, refusing to let her story fade into obscurity. Holidays were unbearable. Her seat at the table remained empty, yet her presence was felt in every corner of the house, her books still stacked on the shelf, her college acceptance letter folded neatly in a drawer. For them, time had not moved forward. It had frozen on that humid June night. Classmates, too, carried their own burdens. Many were young adults now, trying to begin new lives in college or the workforce, but Ridgefield followed them like a shadow. Each time they returned home, the conversation inevitably circled back to Emily. They whispered to each other about their memories from that night, about the fragments of detail that never quite aligned. Some remembered her walking with confidence toward the exit, while others swore she lingered near the bleachers. The uncertainty gnawed at them, leaving behind guilt that maybe they had missed something important. In private, a few admitted to fear. They wondered if speaking up would expose them to suspicion or retaliation. A handful confessed to detectives about small arguments they'd had with Emily, moments of jealousy or frustration, but none of it rose to the level of criminal suspicion. Yet, the unease remained. When the police called back former students for additional questioning months later, no one could bring new information. Each interview was a mirror of the one before. Familiar stories, the same blurred recollections, the same lack of clarity. The investigation itself drifted into the background. Detectives rotated out of the department, case files were transferred between desks, and what had once been treated as an urgent crisis slowly settled into the cold case unit. Leads stopped coming in, tips dried up, and search efforts ceased. Without evidence, there was nothing tangible to chase. Officially, Emily Hart was still considered missing. Unofficially, her case had joined the long list of disappearances without resolution. But for the people of Ridgefield, silence was not neutral. It was corrosive. Friendships fractured under the weight of suspicion. Parents looked at their children's classmates differently, wondering which teenager might have known more than they let on. Families withdrew from one another, no longer certain who to trust. The community that had once prided itself on closeness now spoke in guarded tones, as though every conversation might reveal too much. The gymnasium became a focal point of that unease. Students reported hearing odd noises when the building was quiet, the slam of a door, the creak of floorboards, a fleeting shadow along the wall. Rational explanations could always be given, but the rumors spread anyway. Younger students dared each other to walk across the darkened floor after practice, whispering that Emily's ghost would appear if they called her name. For the Hart family, hearing these stories was a new kind of heartbreak. They wanted their daughter remembered for her life, not as a ghost story whispered by children who hadn't even known her. Still, the vigils continued. Each June, family and supporters gathered at the school steps, holding candles as Emily's name was spoken aloud. Each year, the crowd grew smaller. The town was weary, drained by the lack of progress. For those who still came, the ritual was less about hope for a miracle and more about defiance against forgetting. Emily had been one of them, a bright young woman with a future, and they refused to let her fade into silence, even as the police files gathered dust. Behind closed doors, guilt lingered among those who had been at the party that night. Some confided years later that they carried private suspicions, gut feelings about what they had seen. But at the time, none were willing to step forward. Fear, self-preservation, and doubt kept them quiet. And as months passed, the the chance of truth surfacing on its own grew slimmer. By the end of that first year, Ridgefield had transformed. The town that had once celebrated its children's futures was now defined by one child's disappearance. Silence had become its identity, a silence built on fear, mistrust, and unanswered questions. And as the Hart family looked out at another candlelit vigil, one painful thought began to sink in. Emily's case was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming a memory, and the world was beginning to move on without her. 5 years had passed since Emily Hart walked out of her graduation night and vanished into silence. In the police department, her case file had grown thick with reports, interviews, and false leads, but it now sat dormant in the cold case cabinet. Detectives came and went, some fresh-eyed and determined, others worn down by years of unsolved crimes. Each one would spend a few weeks revisiting Emily's disappearance, flipping through photographs and statements, hoping a new detail might leap off the page. But the pattern never changed. After a short burst of energy, the investigation would go quiet again. The file was heavy with contradictions. Witness statements conflicted so much that even after multiple re-interviews, detectives couldn't build a reliable timeline. The lack of physical evidence meant no forensics could point them in a solid direction. The suspects that had once been at the center of media attention, Emily's ex-boyfriend, the janitor, her best friend, had all been scrutinized, only for their alibis to hold under pressure. It left nothing but speculation, and speculation is where the internet thrived. Online forums became the new meeting place for theories. Some threads ran hundreds of pages long, dissecting every known detail of that night. A growing number of posters insisted Emily had been taken by a passing truck driver. Ridgefield was located near a highway corridor, and the theory suggested a predator could have lingered near the school, waiting for a target. In the absence of witnesses, it became a convenient explanation. But skeptics pointed out the flaw. Emily's car, purse, and phone were all left untouched. If she had willingly walked to the edge of the lot or into a stranger's vehicle, why would she abandon everything? Other voices pushed a different theory, that Emily had chosen to leave on her own. They speculated she was overwhelmed by expectations, that she had secretly planned an escape, and that the graduation party was the perfect cover. Rumors suggested she might have run off with someone older, perhaps someone she had met online. These theories frustrated the Hart family the most. Emily had made college plans, filled out housing forms, and had never shown signs of wanting to disappear. To them, these suggestions felt like attempts to erase the truth of what happened, to blame her instead of whoever took her. The family never stopped pushing back. Emily's mother kept her daughter's face in the local paper, writing letters to editors, begging for anyone with information to come forward. Her father attended town council meetings, demanding updates from law enforcement even when there were none to give. For them, the idea that Emily had run away was not just insulting, but impossible. She had been proud of her future. She had been happy that night. Something had happened to her, and it had happened inside or near that gym. The town itself changed in the years that followed. New students passed through the high school halls, many only faintly aware of the story. But for those who had been there, the gymnasium was no ordinary building. The last verified sighting of Emily placed her inside, near the bleachers, minutes before the lights dimmed and the party ended. That detail clung to investigators and haunted her classmates. It was the one piece of the puzzle that couldn't be shaken. Why was she seen inside but never seen leaving? Detectives debated the possibilities. Had someone intercepted her before she reached the exit? Could she have slipped into a back hallway or been lured into a hidden space within the school? The theories always circled back to the same wall. Without evidence, nothing could be proven. Over time, even seasoned investigators admitted privately that the case seemed unsolvable. For Emily's parents, time only deepened the wound. 5 years meant birthdays celebrated without her, college years that would never happen, and milestones they were forced to watch other children reach while their own daughter remained frozen at 18. Her room stayed the same, a quiet shrine to the future she never lived. They spoke often about the night of the graduation, replaying it in their minds, searching for meaning in every detail. Her mother confessed that sometimes, when driving past the school, she would park and stare at the gymnasium doors, wondering how the building could hold so many secrets and give none away. Hope and despair became intertwined. Each time a detective reopened the file, the family's spirits rose, only to be crushed again when nothing materialized. They knew the odds. National statistics painted a grim picture. After 5 years, the likelihood of recovering a missing person alive was staggeringly low. Yet they clung to the idea that the truth could still be uncovered, even if it meant accepting the worst. By the 5th anniversary of her disappearance, Ridgefield had learned to live with the case like a scar. The yearly vigils continued, but attendance dwindled. The story still appeared in the local newspaper, but the articles were shorter, tucked between routine community updates. In the eyes of many, Emily had become another unsolved case, one of countless names on a long list. But for those who knew her, the silence remained unbearable. Detectives who had once worked the case admitted off-record that it was that single detail, the last sighting inside the gym, that never let them move on fully. It was not just that she had vanished, but that she had vanished from within a place filled with people. It was the kind of gap that couldn't be explained by a random truck driver or a voluntary disappearance. It suggested proximity, familiarity, and secrecy. Someone knew what had happened in those final minutes, and that knowledge had remained hidden for years. 5 years later, the case of Emily Hart had gone cold. But deep in the heart of Ridgefield, the gymnasium still stood, its wooden floor scuffed by generations of students, its bleachers creaking with age. And behind the silence, one haunting truth endured. Emily had been last seen inside, and no one could say what happened when the lights went out. 10 years had passed since Emily Hart disappeared on the night of her graduation. A decade that felt like an eternity to her parents, yet like an instant to those who still remembered the frantic search. In that time, the rhythm of Ridgefield had changed. Life continued, as life always does, but the shadow of what had happened in the high school gym never fully left. The town grew. Children who had been in middle school at the time of Emily's disappearance now attended the same high school, playing basketball on the same hardwood floor, dancing at homecomings beneath the same rafters. For them, the gym was a place of energy and youth. For the older residents, it was haunted ground. By the 10th anniversary, the gymnasium itself had begun to show its age. The wooden floorboards had warped under years of activity, the bleachers squeaked under too much weight, and the roof required repair. The district approved renovations, a necessary investment to keep the school functioning. But for many, the thought of tearing into the building stirred unease. The gym was not just a structure, it was the last known location of Emily Hart. To alter it felt in some unspoken way like disturbing a grave. Parents of the new generation watched their children run drills across the floor, trying to mask their discomfort. Some refused to linger during practices, excusing themselves to wait in cars. Teachers, too, admitted that the renovations felt overdue, yet unsettling. Memories of that night remained vivid for those who had been there. When construction crews discussed plans to pull up the old floorboards, rumors again circulated through town. Whispers spread that maybe the building itself still held secrets. For Emily's parents, the passage of time had not dulled their grief. Her mother's hair had grayed, her father's voice had weakened, but their dedication to finding answers had not faltered. They had become relentless advocates, lobbying for advances in DNA testing and cold case funding. Each new development in forensic science gave them hope that someday, somehow, a new method might reveal the truth. They wrote letters to governors, reached out to investigative journalists, and pleaded with detectives to reopen the file whenever possible. Most times, their requests were met with polite acknowledgments and little action. But still, they refused to stop. Anniversaries became markers of both progress and pain. Each year, a vigil was held outside the school. Attendance had dwindled over the decade, but the family stood firm, candles flickering in their hands, photographs of Emily displayed on poster boards. For them, The vigil was not just remembrance, it was resistance, a refusal to let her fade into the background of forgotten cases. But as the years dragged on, the weight of time grew heavier. Friends who had once rallied around them moved away or started families of their own. The Hart family's fight for answers began to feel increasingly solitary. Inside the community, silence had grown more comfortable. New students at Ridgefield High knew of Emily only through whispers in hallways and occasional mentions in class. Teachers avoided discussing the case in detail, not wanting to stir old wounds. Some parents warned their children not to walk alone at night, not because of any current danger, but because the memory of what had happened lingered. The gym itself became a strange duality, alive with games and dances, yet layered with unspoken dread. Detectives who had once worked the case admitted that it still nagged at them. The image of Emily, last seen inside that gym, remained unresolved. They acknowledged to the family that the trail had gone cold, but privately, some admitted the case felt unfinished. Without evidence, there was nothing to press forward with. Yet without closure, the town itself never felt free of the weight of that night. By the 10th year, the Hart family's persistence had begun to draw attention again. Advances in forensic science were making headlines across the country. Old evidence in other cases was being retested with new methods, producing breakthroughs thought impossible just years earlier. Emily's parents latched onto these stories, believing that if those cases could be solved, so could theirs. They pressed investigators to re-examine what little evidence had been collected, to look again at the fabric samples, the photographs, even the sealed-off maintenance areas of the school. But the requests were always met with the same answer. There was nothing new to test, no new leads to follow. The renovations on the gym only sharpened the contrast between the town moving forward and the family still anchored in grief. As workers laid out plans to modernize the space, Emily's mother voiced her concern to the school board, begging that the work be done carefully, that nothing be overlooked. Though most dismissed her fears as the desperation of a grieving parent, a few in town shared her unease. They wondered quietly if tearing into the structure might disturb something long hidden or perhaps reveal something the community was not ready to face. In Ridgefield, the gym had become both a place of celebration and dread. To the teenagers who cheered and danced there, it was simply a stage for their lives. To their parents, it was a constant reminder of a girl who had walked into that building 10 years earlier and never walked out again. Every squeak of the bleachers, every echo across the court, carried the memory of a night that remained unresolved. And as the renovation plans moved forward, the town was forced to confront an unsettling thought. What if the building itself still held the answer? What if the silence that had hung over Ridgefield for a decade was about to be disturbed, not by progress, but by truth? 15 years after Emily Hart vanished, Ridgefield High School was once again under construction. The gymnasium, worn from decades of use, had reached the point where repairs could no longer be delayed. Water damage had warped the floorboards, creating uneven ridges that made basketball games hazardous. The district approved a full replacement, stripping away the aging wood to pour a fresh foundation. To most in town, the project was routine maintenance. But for those who remembered Emily's case, there was an unspoken unease about disturbing the building where she had last been seen alive. On a humid morning in early June, workers began dismantling the floor. Planks were pried up, nails pulled, and the air filled with the smell of dust and old varnish. Beneath the top layer, the crew expected to find only cracked concrete and debris. Instead, one worker paused, crouching near a corner where the boards met the base of the bleachers. Pressed against the concrete was a small, frayed piece of fabric, yellowed with age but still bearing traces of white. He assumed it was trash left behind from years earlier, but as he tugged it free, more fragments appeared, embedded into the foundation as though they had been trapped there when the floor was first laid. The crew chief was called over, and within minutes, the chatter of work gave way to silence. What they pulled up next made it impossible to dismiss. Among the scraps was a thin piece of satin-like material, the kind used in ceremonial sashes. To anyone else it might have looked meaningless, but to residents of Ridgefield, the connection was immediate. Emily Hart had last been seen wearing a white graduation gown with a scarlet sash. And here, 15 years later, pieces of something eerily similar were surfacing from beneath the very floor she had walked across on her final night. The crew halted the project and notified authorities. By afternoon, the gymnasium was cordoned off with yellow tape. Detectives, crime scene technicians, and forensic teams arrived, cameras in hand, carefully bagging each fragment as potential evidence. The atmosphere in the gym was heavy, as though the past itself had been unearthed. For the investigators who had inherited Emily's cold case, the discovery was both electrifying and horrifying. For years, the prevailing theory had been that she disappeared outside, lured away from the building. Now, a chilling question emerged. Had she never left the gym at all? News of the discovery spread quickly. By evening, rumors gripped the town. Some insisted it proved Emily had been killed inside the school, her remains hidden beneath the floorboards. Others whispered about secret crawl spaces or concealed storage areas no one had checked. Social media lit up with speculation, turning Ridgefield into a point of national curiosity once again. For Emily's parents, the call from detectives was both devastating and strangely affirming. For years, they had told anyone who would listen that their daughter hadn't run away, that something had happened inside that gym. Now, a piece of fabric seemed to echo their worst fears. Investigators worked carefully, combing through every inch of the exposed foundation. They scraped samples from the fabric for DNA testing, photographed its placement, and searched for additional evidence hidden beneath the boards. Workers were interviewed, their accounts logged in detail. Every decision was deliberate, every action measured against the possibility that this was the breakthrough the case had waited 15 years to find. The town's reaction was divided between dread and vindication. Parents who had once told their children to stop asking about Emily now whispered that the truth was finally coming out. Former classmates revisited their memories, shaken by the idea that while they had been dancing and celebrating, something unspeakable may have happened only feet away. For others, the thought was unbearable, too close to the rumors of hauntings that had followed the gym for years. To them, the discovery confirmed the building's reputation as a place where joy and terror coexisted. The Hart family arrived at the school under escort, standing silently outside the taped-off doors. Emily's mother clutched a photograph of her daughter in her graduation gown, her expression unreadable as investigators carried out sealed evidence bags. The image of a white gown and scarlet sash was etched into their memory, and now pieces of that same fabric were being lifted from beneath the place she was last seen alive. For them, the fragments were not just evidence, they were remnants of a life-interrupted tangible proof that Emily's final moments had unfolded much closer to home than anyone had dared to admit. Detectives refused to speculate publicly, but privately the implications were staggering. If the fabric tested positive for Emily's DNA, it would mean that her blood had seeped into the floor of the gym itself. It would prove that whatever happened to her had occurred inside, not outside. It would also raise an even darker question. Who had access to the building in the days following graduation when the floor repairs were completed? If evidence had been concealed beneath the wood, it suggested someone with knowledge and opportunity had hidden the truth deliberately. By the end of the week, the gymnasium stood stripped and silent, its floorboards stacked in neat piles, its foundation exposed to scrutiny. Construction had stopped indefinitely, the once bustling space frozen in time once more. Ridgefield had been forced to confront an unbearable possibility. The mystery that had haunted them for 15 years might have been buried, quite literally, beneath their feet. For the Hart family, the discovery was not closure, but it was movement. After years of begging for attention to their daughter's case, there was finally something tangible, something real. But with that discovery came a new terror. If Emily never left the gym, then someone in Ridgefield had known the truth all along. The fabric fragments found beneath the warped gym floor were carefully sealed in evidence bags and sent to the state forensic lab. For Emily Hart's family, the days that followed were agonizing. They had lived 15 years without answers, but waiting for science to confirm what they already feared was its own kind of torture. Each ring of the phone carried the possibility of finality. Each day without news, another stretch of unbearable silence. When the results came back, there was no ambiguity. The tests confirmed that the fabric contained Emily's blood. The gown and sash fragments matched the description of what she had been wearing the night she vanished. For the first time since her disappearance, the investigation had indisputable physical evidence. It was a revelation that stunned both investigators and the community. Emily Hart had not disappeared into the night, nor been whisked away by a stranger on the highway. She had bled inside the gymnasium of her own high school on the night of her graduation. Detectives now faced the grim reality that Emily likely died that very evening. The case shifted from a missing persons investigation to a homicide inquiry. The discovery reframed every witness statement, every rumor, every lead that had grown cold over the years. If Emily never left the building, then the suspect pool narrowed dramatically. Whoever was responsible had been inside that gym, had access to the space, and had the means to conceal evidence beneath the floor. Investigators began re-interviewing anyone who had been present that night. Former classmates, now in their 30s, were tracked down and questioned again. Many had long since moved away, building new lives far from Ridgefield, but the case dragged them back into memories they had tried to leave behind. Some broke down in tears during interviews, confessing how the discovery had reopened old guilt. Others grew defensive, repeating that they had nothing new to add. The contradictions that plagued the original investigation resurfaced, sightings that overlapped, accounts that blurred. But this time, detectives pressed harder, armed with the knowledge that Emily never stepped outside the school. Attention turned sharply toward those who had access to the gym after graduation night. Maintenance staff, administrators, and even contractors were scrutinized. The warped flooring where the fabric was found had been replaced only days after the graduation party, part of routine upkeep. Investigators now considered whether that work had been used as a cover to conceal evidence. Someone had deliberately sealed Emily's blood and clothing into the foundation of the building. That act could not have been an accident. The implications were chilling. If Emily had been harmed inside the gym, her body might have been hidden, moved, or destroyed before the floor was repaired. It meant someone had not only taken her life, but also manipulated the very structure of the school to erase her presence. Detectives began reviewing maintenance logs, searching for names of those who had worked in the building at the time. One by one, they contacted former employees, asking where they had been during the renovation, who had overseen the floor replacement, and whether anything unusual had been noticed. The community reacted with a mixture of shock and fury. For years, rumors had swirled that Emily had run away or been abducted by a stranger. Now those explanations collapsed under the weight of evidence. It was no longer possible to claim she had left Ridgefield by choice. The truth was far darker. She had never escaped the gymnasium. Old suspicions reignited, tearing through the fragile peace the town had built over the years. Neighbors once again whispered about the janitor, about classmates who had seemed evasive, about staff members with unexplained gaps in their stories. Trust that had barely begun to return was shattered once more. For Emily's parents, the confirmation was devastating, but it also validated what they had always believed. From the first night, they had insisted their daughter had not run away, that something had happened to her in the gym. Now, science has proved them right. Yet the victory was hollow. They had hoped for answers, but what they received was the knowledge that their daughter had suffered inside the very walls where she should have been safest. Detectives now faced the daunting task of combing through years of silence and decay. Memories had faded, witnesses had moved, and suspects had grown comfortable in their anonymity. But the evidence beneath the floor changed everything. This was no longer a mystery of possibility. It was a crime with proof. Someone had sealed Emily's secret into the building, and the discovery meant they had carried that knowledge for 15 years. In town, the atmosphere grew tense. Former students avoided each other, worried that detectives might interpret old rivalries as new evidence. Teachers who had supervised graduation night were dragged back into interrogation rooms, forced to recall details they barely remembered. Maintenance workers, some long retired, were scrutinized with suspicion. Every familiar face was now a potential accomplice to the cover-up. The Hart family stood at the center of it all, weathering a storm they had carried alone for too long. At a press conference, Emily's mother clutched her daughter's photograph as detectives announced the DNA findings. Her voice broke as she said what many had feared, but no one had been able to prove. Her daughter had died that night. Yet as she spoke, her grief gave way to determination. She demanded justice, not just for Emily, but for the community that had lived with lies for so long. The discovery forced one final haunting question to the surface. Who had the power, the access, and the opportunity to bury evidence inside the foundation of Ridgefield High School? Someone had carried that secret for 15 years, and investigators knew they were finally running out of places to hide. The discovery of Emily Hart's blood-stained gown fragments reignited the investigation with a force that shook Ridgefield to its core. Detectives now had evidence that pointed inward, to the school itself, and suspicion quickly settled on those who had worked inside the building. As names were drawn from maintenance records, one figure stood out, a former custodian named Richard Hale. At the time of Emily's disappearance, Hale had been assigned to the gymnasium, responsible for securing equipment and locking up the building. He had since retired and moved to a quiet neighborhood 2 counties away. Hale's name had surfaced briefly in the original investigation, but his alibi, shopping at a hardware store the following morning, seemed to clear him. He had never been charged, never labeled a suspect. But now, with Emily's blood found beneath the gym floor, detectives circled back. His proximity to the building and the timing of scheduled repairs made his role impossible to ignore. They paid him a visit, not with casual questions this time, but with photographs of the fragments and a direct explanation of the DNA results. At first, Hale repeated what he had said years earlier. He insisted he had locked up the gym as instructed, that he had left the premises without incident, and that he had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance. But investigators pressed harder. They laid out the timeline, reminding him that the flooring had been replaced within days of graduation. They asked who, besides him, had access to the crawl spaces and maintenance areas beneath the bleachers. They emphasized that the fabric could not have embedded itself in the foundation by accident. Hale shifted in his seat, his voice faltering as the weight of the evidence bore down. The second interview stretched for hours. Detectives reminded him that advances in forensic science would not stop at the gown fragments. They could test soil, wood fibers, even bolts and fixtures for traces of DNA. They explained that they were prepared to dismantle the entire gym if necessary, and they told him plainly that if he came forward now, he could at least tell the truth before it was dragged from him. The pressure mounted until his composure finally cracked. Hale's confession spilled out in halting bursts, the story of a man who had never intended to kill, but who had spent 15 years burying a secret beneath the lives of everyone around him. He admitted that on graduation night, he had been inside the gym supply room, pocketing tools and equipment he planned to sell. It wasn't the first time he had stolen from the school, but it was the first time he had been caught. Emily, on her way out, had opened the door and seen him rifling through the shelves. She recognized him immediately. He claimed she threatened to report him, her voice sharp with the conviction of someone who believed adults should be held accountable. Panic surged through him. In his words, he just wanted to silence her, to stop her from shouting. He struck out with the back of his hand. Emily stumbled, hitting her head against the metal frame of the bleachers. He said she collapsed instantly, her body crumpling in a way that made it clear she was not getting back up. In shock, Hale claimed he froze. He checked her pulse, found nothing, and then spiraled into desperation. He feared the police would discover his theft, that he would lose his job and his freedom. But more than that, he feared being accused of murder. So instead of calling for help, he made a decision that would haunt the town for years. He dragged Emily's body into a narrow crawl space beneath the bleachers, an area rarely accessed except during repairs. Days later, when contractors arrived to replace portions of the warped flooring, Hale saw an opportunity. He did not move the body itself, but he shifted items, pressing parts of her gown and sash deeper into the foundation, concealing them where no one would think to look. When the new boards were nailed into place, he believed her secret, and his, was sealed forever. Detectives listened in stunned silence as Hale recounted the details. His tone alternated between remorse and rationalization, as though he could not decide whether to paint himself as a panicked man or a hardened criminal. But one fact was undeniable. His actions had robbed a young woman of her life and condemned a family to 15 years of agony. When news of the confession broke, Ridgefield erupted with shock and anger. Some residents had long suspected someone connected to the school, but few had imagined it would come from such a banal motive: petty theft and fear of exposure. The simplicity of the crime contrasted violently with the scale of its impact. A whole community had been fractured, haunted, and reshaped by what was, in Hale's words, a mistake that spun out of control. For Emily's parents, the confession was both vindication and devastation. They had always believed she hadn't run away, always insisted she had been harmed that night. Now they knew the truth, but the truth was almost unbearable. Their daughter had not been targeted by some shadowy predator. She had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time, and a man trusted with her school's care had turned her into a secret buried beneath its floor. Hale was arrested and charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering. He would spend his remaining years behind bars, his quiet retirement shattered by the truth finally clawing its way to the surface. But for Ridgefield, the scars would remain. The gymnasium was no longer just a place of rumor and myth. It was now proven to have been a crime scene, a place where celebration had turned into horror. And as investigators closed their files, one truth lingered painfully clear. Emily Hart had never walked out of her graduation. She had died inside the gym, her fate hidden beneath the very floor that bore the weight of her classmates' final dance. The confession left Ridgefield reeling. For 15 years, the disappearance of Emily Hart had been a wound that never closed, a question that no one could answer. Now the truth was out, and it was worse than most had imagined. She had not been stolen away by a stranger or whisked off to some distant town. She had died inside the very place that should have been safest, her life silenced by a man entrusted with her school's care. For Emily's parents, the revelation was a paradox. They had spent over a decade pleading for answers, demanding that her case not be forgotten. Now, with the truth in front of them, the relief of knowing collided with the unbearable weight of finality. They would never see their daughter walk through the door, never hear her laughter ring across the house again. What they had gained was certainty, but it was certainty that destroyed hope. The town gathered in the gymnasium for a memorial unlike any Ridgefield had ever seen. The hardwood floor had been refinished, the bleachers repaired, but beneath the gleam lay the knowledge of what had been hidden for so long. Rows of candles flickered as classmates, neighbors, and strangers alike stood shoulder to shoulder, listening as Emily's name was spoken aloud. Her photograph, taken in her graduation gown hours before she vanished, was displayed at center court. It was a reminder not just of what had been lost, but of how close she had been to the life she deserved. The school board voted to rededicate the gym in her honor. A plaque bearing her name was mounted on the wall, etched with words that spoke of memory, resilience, and justice delayed. For students who would walk those halls in years to come, it was meant to ensure she was never forgotten, that her story remained tethered to the place where it had ended. Richard Hale, the retired custodian, was charged and sentenced, his quiet life shattered by the secret he had carried for 15 years. But punishment did little to ease the ache of what had been taken. The truth had finally surfaced, yet the cost was immeasurable. In the end, the discovery beneath the gym floor revealed what the town had long feared. Emily Hart never left her graduation night.